Good evening and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns Hour here on YouTube and Periscope. My name is Tom Luongo. It is Monday, March 4th, 2019. We've got a lot to talk about. Though I'm not really sure what I want to talk about tonight. Actually, that's not true. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. Remember, we do this every Monday night at 8 p.m. We also do this again on Friday nights at 8:30. This is your hour of, well, I would say rationality in a world going slowly or even quickly mad. You can follow my work over at tomluongo.me. You can support it over at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns. And if this is the first time you're here tonight, please stop by and say hello in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to do about 15 minutes worth of opening question or commentary about various things that are on my mind. And then we'll open it up for questions, and the conversation will just go organically as to wherever it decides to take us. So so let's start with that one. Speaking of, I'm going to get into some thoughts on Venezuela, and I really do want to discuss a little bit more what I posted this morning as a live stream on my channel about Tulsi Gabbard. But James reminds me that it was windy here in Florida today. Actually, the last couple of days, it's going to get cold again. We're going to have one last cold snap. It's early March. Hopefully, it will not freeze, so that we can actually get some fruit this year, because everything has bloomed, and now we're hoping that the blooms don't get frozen off. Now, it would be nice to actually get some peaches and some apples and plums and other things that we've got planted around the property. I don't know about you guys, but that's the way I would love to see that happen. I'd like to see all of my wife's hard work over the last 3 or 4 years eventually, quote unquote, bear fruit. So, but James reminds us that his windmill spun today. I could use the internet. As a matter of fact, I went out for a walk earlier in the evening, and as I want to do, and walk down and do about 1.5 miles and walk down my driveway and around and to the other mailboxes close to 441, and then back again. And my neighbors, who were, by the way, nearly 1/4 mile away at what amounts to the head of my driveway, I was walking by and I noted her windmill was spinning really rapidly. I'm like, why does she not have that hooked up to at least, a 9-volt? Yeah, the season transition is awesome this year, and it's and I wrote an article over the weekend about Elon Musk and global warming and why everybody needs religion and all of that stuff. And this is stuff, if you've been following, I don't know how much you guys follow this. My wife spends a lot of time watching stuff on YouTube, and it's morphed away from Jordan Peterson and then into like all the celebrity atheists and how they're trying desperately to define religion without actually having a religion, to define meaning and ethics and morals without actually using religion to do so. And she just finds it really funny watching them do it. Not that either of us are, we're going to in any way kind of organize religion or anything like that, but we don't deny the fact that people fundamentally will take on something else if they reject, a classic religion like Catholicism or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or whatever, spaghetti monster stuff, then they're going to make something up. In my case, I, at various times in my life have, used the, Star Wars, or, some people use Lord of the Rings or the Grateful Dead. And at another point during, early in my college career, I looked at the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and I went, that is a substitute for God pretty damn well, actually. And what it did, of course, is it said to me, okay, well, if you don't know that much about the universe, you're smart enough to know that you don't know everything, then you have to admit to yourself, in fact, that what you don't know is more powerful than what you do know. And therefore, you should really think very carefully about what you do here. Because at the end of the day, all we will have after we leave here, if you don't believe in any other form of higher being or anything, is what you did, what you left behind. And if you leave behind a life like Michael Jackson, which I just read an article on Kunstler on Zero Hedge, of debauchery and filth and pederasty and the rest of it, regardless of how much music he made, that might have been somewhat good. If that's all you're going to leave the world with, well, then, what's the point? And this is the fundamental problem with leftists. This is the fundamental problem with the global warming myth. It is itself a religion. By environmentalism, when it is raised to the level of religion, becomes dangerous. And I'm in no way, manner, shape, or form am I against being a good steward in the environment, for example. And I was yelled at by multiple environmentalists over the weekend when you write an article that proclaiming that global warming is bullshit. By the way, everything is NSFW tonight. When you declare that global warming is bullshit, and you actually believe that the world is cooling because you can look right outside your window and see that global temperatures are plummeting, and that on a year-over-year basis, and you can also see that there has been no net warming on an aggregate basis for the last 15 or 18 years. And you can also see that the weather patterns are becoming more and more violent, and those are the hallmarks of transition periods from one state to another. Excuse me. So libertarianism can easily be a terrible religion, and at some point it probably did substitute for a religion for me at one point, but I understand that as well as not being the end all and be all of meaning in my life, right? It doesn't create meaning. All it can do is libertarianism as a belief system isn't there to bring meaning. It's a way to bring order, and it's a way to bring an ethical structure and a moral structure in some ways to how to act in a positive sense, behavioral sense. I guess so. I guess it would work that way, but I wouldn't consider it to be terribly spiritual. Right? That you remember that there's it again. It's kind of the non-aggression principle and libertarianism as a religion. What it has going for positively is that you become incredibly humble, believe it or not. Humility is the name of the game, because at the end of the day, you don't have the ability to, you've decided, or you believe fundamentally that using aggressive force to achieve your personal political goals is anathema to who you are and to your moral and ethical precepts. Well, then, therefore, you don't really have a whole lot of tools at your disposal then to affect the world. And every decision you make, you should weigh carefully as best you can. And you're responsible for every decision you've ever made. And you're responsible for the consequences of all of your behavior. No one else is. And you can't foist those consequences onto somebody else. Economists call this externalities. I'm sorry. Eventually, those externalities are paid, whether you get away with it or not. At the end of the day, you should always take on only exactly the amount of responsibility for your actions that your actions engender, and not an iota more. So it's kind of an interesting problem. I didn't really want to get off on this subject to start the evening. I was going to talk about Venezuela shortly, and then maybe talk about Tulsi Gabbard. But I think it all has a way. I'll be able to worm my way back around to where I wanted to go with this, because at the end of the day, everybody's belief system is what drives them ultimately to do what they do. And once you glom onto something as a religion, once you glom onto it, you can do, again, positive or negative things with it. Marxists, Marx preached that religion was the opiate of the masses. Well, to environmentalists, if they've become toxic in their belief system, that the only way for them to achieve their goals is to expropriate wealth, and to then have the Marxist philosophers tell them, well, everything is okay, everything is permissible because nothing's real anyway. That's the whole very dangerous conceit of postmodernism. Because, again, at the end of the day, Marxists don't believe in property because they have to twist themselves into rhetorical knots in order to negate the concept of property. Because then once they allow for the concept of property at any level, even at the personal level, into the discussion, their entire intellectual edifice crumbles. Right? I was talking about this with Camille this morning. She was listening to some philosophers like debunk Stefan Molyneux. Because apparently that's what philosophical YouTube does. Somebody puts out a video, and then somebody else does a video in response to that video, and then somebody else responds to that video, and yada yada yada. And they told two friends, and they go back and forth because they don't actually have a conversation with each other. God forbid. This is the 21st century. People can't have a conversation with each other. All we can do is look into a microphone and rant at each other. Forget that shit, right? So now I'm going to be guilty of doing exactly that because I am a modern guy after all. So. But we were watching this thing last night, and it was funny how, Molyneux's, I don't know, they were bitching about Molyneux, ripping off Kant without giving him Immanuel Kant without giving him any credit for it. I can't remember what the hell it was, for universal something behavior, universal proper behavior or something. I don't know, whatever the fuck Molyneux, whatever weird thing Molyneux's gone off on in terms of his application of libertarianism and the non-aggression principle. I find him, for the most part, insufferable. Mostly because I just think he's a putz. But whatever, it doesn't matter. He's still allowed to be a putz and do his thing. But what's interesting is that this philosopher was going off on Molyneux being wrong about all these other things, and then they got talking about, and then he and the host got talking about, well, I think Molyneux is a libertarian. I'm like, you guys think? He's only been on the fucking internet, he's only been on YouTube for 15 years doing this shit, and you think he's a libertarian? Like, do you even know who you're talking about? I mean, the man has a huge, obviously these are two schmucks that have smaller channels than the two of them together have smaller channels than Stefan Molyneux does, right? That they think he's a libertarian, and then this English guy says, "Oh, I can't." As libertarians, and they all believe in property as the ultimate conceit and all of this stuff. And he's like, I think that's kind of dodgy. It's typical fucking limey. And he's like, yeah, but then again, I'm a Marxist. I'm like, well, that just I'm just thinking to myself, well, that just invalidates everything you just said, right? Because how can you be? And then I knew exactly where he was going with this. It was like because he's like, I don't. And he said exactly what I always wind up hearing out of Marxist mouths whenever I confront them on the concept of ownership. And they always say the same thing. All the well-trained ones, all the university-trained ones, right? They all say the same goddamn thing. They all say this. Well, I don't really believe in property, and the whole concept of ownership is. I'm like, so I asked the very basic question. I've done this before, and I've talked about this in previous live streams ages ago. I said, well, do you own yourself? I do this with my Marxist. I have a highly intellectual, very smart, brilliant Marxist friend of mine. And I'm like, do you own yourself? And he said this is the first time I ever encountered this. This was 10 years ago. And he didn't want to answer the question. And I said, come on, it's the simplest question in the world. Do you own yourself? And he thought about it for a minute. He knew I had him dead to rights. You get to see it happening. You can see his eyes flitting back and forth, accessing memory, working out. I can do the whole Bombard's body language thing on you. It's so obvious that this was what was going on. I'm like, how do I get out of this? I know there's a trap here. And eventually it comes down to the answer of, I'm uncomfortable with this concept of ownership. And I said, well, that's nice. I don't give a fuck. Do you own yourself? And I ran into this when I argued with a Marxist who doesn't even have a name anymore on Halsey's channel a year and a half ago. And I ran into with this guy, this limey guy last night, listening to him. He's like, yeah, I'm a Marxist. I don't really believe in this whole ownership thing. This whole property thing is doesn't make sense philosophically. I'm like, yeah, of course it doesn't make sense philosophically. You're a Marxist. And the reason why they have this real problem with ownership is because once they define ownership of themselves, they can no longer deny you the ownership of your own and the sovereignty and the inviolability of your individual being. You're no longer part of the collective. You're an individual. And then when I run into people like this and I hear this, I wish I was a part of that conversation, because the minute that guy said that, I started screaming in my living room, or in my kitchen, like a freaking madman. I'm like, you stupid fucking limey bastard. Come on, man. The reason you're uncomfortable with the concept of self-ownership is because it destroys your concept. It destroys your entire philosophical construct. So if that's the case, then if you don't own yourself, who does? And the other corollary is if no one owns you, then how do you assert an I? How can you assert an identity if you don't even own yourself? How can you, the minute you say, I am Doug, I am Tom, I am a jelly donut, I am a meat popsicle. The minute you say that, I am anything, you're asserting ownership over your own being. Period. Period. You can't get around that. So you have to negate everything. You have to give up you have to give up literally everything in order to be this thing. To be able to justify that position. I just look at them. That's fucking nonsense. Of course you are who you are. You respond to your name. You respond to stimuli. When somebody snaps their fingers in your face, you react to it. It's his owners. I mean, dude, stimulus response, you're who you are. If I punch you in the face, you're going to say no? And of course, what are you going to do? Just stand there and take it? You don't have the right to fall. You don't have the right to fight back. You don't have a right to assert ownership over your own body. You just told me you didn't. So if you don't own it, then I can use it for my own purposes, just like I can use the ground for my own purposes or not. Doesn't make any difference. This is the whole problem with fucking insane Marxists. They know goddamn well that their shit is, that they literally are full of shit. And they spend their entire lives going through the mental gymnastics that would earn them gold medals at the fucking Olympics against 15-year-old Romanian girls, for Christ's sake. And yet they continue on this path because they want the power. They want the control. They want to be able to justify to you and to everybody else, it's okay, we're going to take power and we're going to use that power. No different than John Bolton admitting he likes power in the White House and he's going to destroy Venezuela because it suits his purposes. At least he's honest about it. At least he's not like, trying to make himself feel good about destroying other people. No, he doesn't give a shit. It does make him feel good to destroy other people. These other people, the fundamental problem with Marxists who go this route is that they do not want to admit to themselves their capacity, as Jordan Peterson would put it all the time, their capacity for malevolence. They refuse to admit their shadow. They have to be able to justify their bad behavior. They just want to be able to justify pointing a gun at you and saying, give me your shit. Why? Because I need it. Why? Because I'm going to do good things with it. Why? Because I fucking want it. That's it. That's all it comes down to. Everything else is bullshit. Life is pain, Highness. Everyone who tells you differently is selling you something, right? At the end of the day, either people are willing to trade with you honestly or they're talking their fucking book and trying to steal something from you. So, human behavior is not perfectly predictable. Exactly, Mark Bogosian. I don't know that it's perfectly predictable. This is the fundamental problem with because human behavior is not one, predictable, or two, perfectible. It's not perfectible. As a matter of fact, what the non-aggression principle is stating is what you should try to do. Okay? Is what you should try to live up to. But you have to realize that you're never going to achieve it. That's the humility part. That's the humbling part. You realize that you have a capacity for doing horrible things in this life. Now the question is, should you pay for the full consequences of those horrible actions? I would say yes. Period. In every way. What does government do? What are the Marxists trying to do? The Marxists are trying to socialize the consequences by saying, I'm doing it for the greater good. I'm doing it for something better, something more nobler than me. You're trying to wrap themselves in some higher concept that means that the individual has to be trampled. What I'm telling you is, at the end of the day, look, we all do things in this life that we're not proud of. And we're going to have to pay the costs of them. sometimes they're as simple as raising your voice and yelling at your wife when she didn't deserve it. How many of us are guilty of that? Could be really terrible. You wish you go through life and that's the worst thing you ever do. Yell at somebody who didn't deserve it. Overreact to a perceived slight or whatever. It's not a matter of ridding yourself. It's actually exactly that. The big problem is not that you're not perfect. The big problem is that you refuse to admit that you will never be perfect. Because once you accept the fact that you have the capacity for doing horrible things, that is exactly what will attenuate your behavior. Because when you understand it in yourself, you can see it in everybody else. And you can have empathy for the other person who's going through exactly the same thing you are. Have I ever debated Wolf? I don't even know who Wolf is, Laura Powers, but I don't mean to be flip. No, I have not. So ownership is essential for individual rights. Without individual rights, we can't be created. Without individual rights, we can't have society. We can't even have a community. We can't have a family. We can't have anything. Right. They see, first, they're uncomfortable. Edwin Smith. Marxists deny the concept of individuality and assign all ownership to the collective. But they're already uncomfortable with this concept of ownership. And every doctrinaire Marxist I've ever met goes through the same thing. They refuse to accept ownership, and they refuse to answer the question, do they own themselves? And I just look at them and go, if you don't own yourself, then who does? Well, somebody owns you. Either practically or practically or not, someone owns you. And if so, then give me your shirt. No, I'm cold. Give me your shirt. Why? Because I don't need to have a reason why. You don't own it. Give me your shirt. I was arguing with Marxists ages ago when we were at a Patriot at a rally to protest the Patriot Act back in Gainesville ages ago. I was sitting there. We were seated right next to the Marxists, and they started going on and on and on about property. And Camille just turned to one of these little twerps, literally one of these little twerps, and said, "Fine, give me your car." What? Give me your car. Why? I want to go. It doesn't matter why. You don't own it. Give me your car. I want to go get a coffee. Go. Shut up. The guy's like, no. I'm like, well then, fuck you. Shut up. You don't get to talk about how private property is evil, and then assert that you own private property. Fuck you. It's like, give me your car. It's like, it's ridiculous. Bolton's not a capitalist. Bolton was a capitalist. He talked like me. All right, so I didn't mean to get off on a rant here or anything, to quote Dennis Miller, but let's talk about, so this is why things like Venezuela go on. Because at the end of the day, once you set up these collectivist structures, and once you give credence to the idea that that some pigs are more equal than others, then we can have John Bolton and Mike Pompeo creating a nightmare for the people of Venezuela. So I believe in a load title. You're goddamn right I do. None of us own our cars. None of us have the manufacturer's certificate of origin of our cars. We all have a certificate of title granted to us by the state in which we bought our car. A legal title, the manufacturer's certificate of ownership is never, you never get it. I think you're allowed to get, you might be able to get it in Texas, at least you used to be able to. Now, all this stuff about talk about individuality is important because what it does is, and the non-aggression principle, because what it does is it sets the baseline for how you build constructive relationships between humans. Okay? And you understand that you do not have the right to use aggression. Once you understand that, and once you assert ownership over yourself, and you assume that you have, and by asserting ownership of yourself, you assert the right to life and the right and the right to everything else after that. Once you're there, then it's just a matter of, okay, well, what abrogates your right to life? Theft, murder, fraud, libel, which are all variations on theft. That's what this interesting thing about this Limey guy is like, well, the taxes are theft. These libertarians, they believe this weird concept that taxes are theft. I'm like, it's not really weird, dude. Taxes are theft. I earned it. I own it. My property, this cup, these glasses, this fucking spit filter, these are all things that exist in my life because they represent a portion of my life that I spent to acquire the capital necessary to buy this thing. Okay? This thing. This hat, $29 on Amazon, for those of you who are interested. It's a portion of my life, which is the only scarce natural resource any of us have. Everything else is abundant. Okay? I look at these people and I say, you don't own yourself? Well, then why the fuck do you think you have a right to breathe air? Who gave you that? Where does that come from? If you don't assert why do you keep breathing? I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. You just look like a fucking hypocrite. You rant? Me perish the thought, I know, really. Yes, we rent our cars. We actually just, no, what we do with that, see, the reason, okay, going back to, oh God, I can jump all over it. I can do this shit all night. Literally, this is one of those things that I don't even talk about on a regular basis anymore because we're like so deep into the friggin' geopolitical bullshit. But to remind yourselves where I come from all this stuff, it's kind of important every once in a while to like remind yourself what it is that we actually are talking about and why we're anti-war, why we're anti-John Bolton, why someone like Tulsi Gabbard becomes an interesting figure politically, given the structures of our society and how they're breaking down and why they're breaking down and why we're not talking to each other and yada yada yada. So all of this stuff. Rant? Look, Tom's blood pressure's up again because we're talking about socialists. Dude, seriously, it's not even that we're not talking about socialists. I'm talking about socialists. I'm the one who started this rant. You guys did not prompt this at all. As a matter of fact, you probably didn't want me to go on this rant tonight. Yeah, excuse me. I still have a lingering cough from that cold I had last week. It's better today than it was yesterday and the day before. One Isaac asks an important question, a corollary to all this. Yes, you own most of your money. No, I own all of my money, by the way. But what about pooling our money to build roads and infrastructure? How much of a percentage of your income to taxes do you think is fair? I think it's zero. I don't think, and I'll tell you why. And it's because taxes are theft. It's because taxes are involuntary. Because taxes always have a gun. There's no implied gun with taxes. It's either pay your taxes or go to fucking jail, or if you still refuse to go to jail or pay up or whatever they're going to do, then they shoot you. Right? That's what happens. So there's a gun. Now, the basic idea, what banks were supposed to be for, what we're supposed to do when we're building an economic system, is that we're supposed to save today or tomorrow to build a bigger project. In the Robinson Crusoe economy, if I want a shelter over my head, then I have to spend twice the amount of time procuring food on Monday, right? To then have enough time on Tuesday to still eat and build a shelter, right? So I'm going to spend all day Tuesday procuring the things I need to build a roof over my head, right? That roof is a bigger project than procuring food. It's a second order good. I have to go grab leaves and twigs and you know and branches and whatnot, and then stick them in the ground and build some kind of structure and yada yada yada. It's a second order good. Now extrapolate that out to the larger society. What are you doing? What's the in symbolic terms, or in general terms, what are you doing? You're saving first, and then applying your savings to a project that's larger, that has deferred consumption. You save and defer consumption in order to engage in investment and industry over time. Correct? This is the basis for all economic activity. This is what humans do. So now, if you want to build a road or a bridge or a bank or a school or a thing, and it's bigger than you, it's a project that's bigger than you, well, then you have to invest in other things. You have to invest in other people. You've got to pool savings across the entire community. You've got to do all these other things. You have to build a division of labor up way, way beyond the Robinson Crusoe thing, right? So that we can get to a point where the division of labor can handle building up a road, to build a road between here and everybody's home, and then to build a bridge across the river so that we can reach the next town and maybe trade with them who have goods that we don't have, and all that basic stuff. What's the process by which that happens? Which should be through the voluntary application of invested savings. What were banks supposed to do? What are banks still supposed to do today? Banks are supposed to be a place for us to pool our savings at a community level and have the heads of the bank, the bankers themselves, assess the potential investment projects that are available within the community in order to fund that big project by pooling everybody's savings, and then everybody who was invested in the bank will get a portion of the return on that investment if it's a good investment. So if it's an investment that's going to return a positive return, say 8%, I don't know, say we pool $20,000 worth of savings, just $100,000 worth of savings to build, this bridge over the creek. Okay, fine. So it costs us $100,000. So we're going to forego our savings. We're going to forego access to our savings for the 2 years it's going to take to build this bridge. But there's a plan in place to build that bridge, and that's going to bring back a return on investment in some other way. I don't know. Either we're going to put a toll on the bridge, or it's going to open up. It's going to be tied to contracts, trading contracts with the next town or whatever. And somehow the people who deferred access to their money are going to see over a 2-year period, they're going to see a 5% compounded return, because the bank lent the money out to the bridge building company or the guy who was going to build the bridge, and he borrowed at 6%, and you as the he borrowed at 6% interest, and the bank shares half the interest with you and takes half for itself. It's a good deal. You didn't have to do anything other than defer consumption for a little bit of time. That's the way the economy works, right? Except for the problem that it's all fractionally lended. It's all fractionally lent. Sorry, lended. Meaning that $100,000 that was in the bank is lent out 10 times, and there are 10 claims of that property, which creates its own problem. And the chain of custody of the ownership of the capital that the pool of savings represents has been broken. There's now 10 people out there with claims on your dollar that you got in the bank. And I've explained that before. I am a fan of, I fundamentally believe in 100% reserve banking because it never violates the private property precept, including of the money itself. That there's only ever one person who owns the money, who has access to the money at any unit and period of time. So my answer to you, one, and I mean this sincerely, is 0. I want that kind of stuff done through the private markets, because the private markets will figure out the best way, time, and everything else by coordinating the structure of production based on where capital is most needed at any one time, because the banker and the savings and the rate of savings of the community was going to rise and fall depending on economic conditions, depending on how the weather and all the other, everything that goes into it, right? Goes into our decisions. The only way to account for all of those variables is to allow people to do with their money as they see fit and have nobody get in the way of that. That is the most efficient way. It's still not perfectly efficient. In no way, manner, shape, or form is it perfectly efficient. I don't have perfect information about what's going on in the world. I have my biases. I have my propensity to oversave, and you have your propensity to overconsume. But regardless of anything else, no one knows your life and your life circumstances better than you. Just like nobody knows my life and my life circumstances better than me, except for maybe my wife. And by definition, everybody here who's acting, even though they don't have great information, they still have better information than the central planners who are deciding what the rate of interest should be. Now, the banker's job is to be very good at assessing the relative profitability after looking at a smattering of investments. Well, I have these 15 investments that are available to me. This, where should that money go? Well, obviously, it should go where the highest profit margin is, because wherever the highest profit margin is where the market is demanding the highest, is handicapping the highest rate of return. But it's their job to profit versus risk, and profit includes all of that: risk, reward, all of that stuff. That's what the bankers are supposed to do. Everybody is corrupt. So now the question is, Laura Powers is asking, national banks are interesting, but can a corrupt guy do plenty of damage? Of course they can. Just like a local banker can do tremendous amounts of damage. It's going to happen. People are going to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. No system is perfect. You're not asking for perfection. You're asking for the best system. That best system is still massively inefficient. But when you really stop to look at how brilliant, when you reorient your thinking and see that what man has been achieved in spite of government and not because of it, you say to yourself, fucking people are amazing. That they can do what they do, knowing full well that the government will take 40% of whatever they make. But what that says, of course, is that the projects that wind up getting funded have to be so unbelievably in demand and profitable to overcome the massive barrier to entry, the massive amount of, effectively, what I would call the transition energy. If you're thinking about this in terms of like a chemical reaction, it's the same thing. It's energy. It's an energy barrier you have to overcome. The taxes and the bureaucracy and the permitting and all this shit. You get all that stuff done. It really does tell you, oh my God, how much time are we wasting? And then look at what we're able to achieve. It's amazing. So it's called 100% return. I believe in 100% reserve banking standard. I'm very Rothbardian when it comes to this. So I'm very much a fan of Murray Rothbard on this. So, if you want to make sure that bank runs don't, because look, every bank out there today is insolvent. The only question is whether or not you're going to go out there and test their insolvency by demanding all of your savings right now. If we all did that, all the banks would fail tomorrow, because they're levered out 8 to 10 times what they actually have available to them. Full reserve banking. The only honest bank has 100% reserves. Fractional reserve banking is fraudulent. You're absolutely right, Edmund Smith. It's fraudulent. It's fraud. It's theft. Okay? It's theft. And you are more than welcome, Juan. It was a good question. It was an excellent question. I loved answering it because, Jesus Christ, I love doing this stuff. I never do it. We always wind up talking about friggin' tactics and strategy and politics and all the other shit. Which, by the way, I do when I love and it's fun, but it's draining. This stuff is real. This is being able to explain this stuff to you, being able to talk about this stuff in a in a substantive way. I mean, I'm doing this tonight, and what I'm talking about tonight has nobody interested. By the way, there's only 46 people in the chat tonight, as opposed to the normal 70 or 75. You wonder why. So, because it's just funny. This is the stuff that tells you, that separates. It tells you all the things you need to know about what's wrong with our society. Okay, we're so far removed from what would be a rational and sustainable society. It's unbelievable. "100% reserve banking. What's the basis for currency?" Well, it can be anything. I would prefer it to be backed by. A hard currency with no counterparty risk. So I would prefer it to be backed by gold, or I would prefer it to be backed. I consider cryptos like Bitcoin to be close to gold, but something like that. And I really do believe that we're at the first stage of our existence. I've said this before with something like Bitcoin. The reason gold is because it has no counterparty risk. It's just gold, right? Nobody else, as long as nobody else can claim that physical gold, if you own it and you have a legal title to that gold because, well, you own it and you didn't steal it from somebody, it's yours. No bank can go bankrupt and steal your gold from you, take your gold from you, right? Or they can't, you have electronic dollars sitting in a bank account over at your local bank or credit union. Well, you got news for you. They go belly up. You're going to be fighting with the FDIC to get your money back. You don't own it. The counterparty risk is the bank can go belly up. All right. I would prefer it to be based on something that has no counterparty risk, because once you have a money that has no counterparty risk, well, and I have this, then you have a system that is sustainable and is also as incorruptible as it can possibly be. Okay, I'm not saying that it's not going to be corrupt. It's not going to have corrupt elements to it. Of course, there's potential for corruption because people have imperfect knowledge, and because people are people, and there are bad people in the world, and some of them become bankers. It's just, and sometimes shit happens that's beyond everybody's control. And I'm not saying that the banks shouldn't engage in underwriting, and they shouldn't have insurance, and there shouldn't be reinsurance banks, and there shouldn't be all these other things. Of course there can be. All that shit should happen, and I want all that stuff, but I want it done in a risk model that is based on real savings and not orders of magnitude of credit, which is capable of massive deflation when all the loans have to be called in. There's nothing wrong with credit. But credit cannot be the entire basis for the economy, which is what we have today. Because at that point, you have destroyed all of the collateral change. You've destroyed the anchor by which and you've destroyed people's legal standing to their money and to their property, period. Oh, I have looked into modern monetary theory. It's bullshit. It basically says that savings, it basically says that debt is savings, and that we should just spend whatever we want. It's ridiculous. MMT is retarded. And I mean that word, and I use that word in a sentence, and I mean it exactly the way I intended, and I meant it to be as unfucking PC as possible. MMT is fucking retarded. And the people who created it did so in order to justify, just like Keynes, just like Samuelson and the rest of them, the Chicago School and the rest of them, did so in order to justify their thievery. It's just another version of frickin' Marxism. So Northland Siska asks, how does halal or Islamic banking, usury-free banking, work? I know it's an Islamic thing. Is there anything we can learn from it? Yes, there is. Islamic banking does not allow for interest. I'm not a big fan of Islamic banking, but I understand why they do what they do. What you can do in Islamic banking is, in order to get a return on your investment, the investor up front has to tell you what the rate of return is going to be and pay you that. That's how they get around interest. They don't say, I'm going to borrow 10%. I'm going to borrow $10,000 and I'm going to pay you $108,000 a year from now. What they say is, this investment is worth $108,000. You just need to give me $100,000, and I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to pay you back $108,000. They do. It's really semantics, but everybody share. But the way I'm doing a bad job of it. I know, because I've actually looked into Islamic banking to understand how it works. In that the way they define it legally is that you are, as an investor, you're an owner. You're an owner in the project, effectively, itself, as opposed to just being the one, as opposed to the person who took out the loan having ownership of the project in and of itself, and then it's just paying back a promissory note. There's no promissory note. Everybody who's involved in putting up the capital shares in the responsibility. So there is something to be learned from that, and that everybody who is investing has skin in the game. To get their return back, they better hope that it's the right process. It better be that everybody did their due diligence to get back out of the project what they thought they were going to put into it, what they thought they were going to, what they were going to get in return, right? So yes. So I think there is something to be learned from it. I think everybody should look into Islamic banking. Just so you understand how it works, because it's used in places like Malaysia and Turkey and a lot of Islamic countries. They don't use, certainly Iran, they don't use interest. They only talk about rate of return on the project itself. So yes, Laura Powers, what I'm saying is that gold is less corrupt than paper. Absolutely. Unless, of course, that paper is backed by gold, like 100% convertible. And even then, it's not as good as gold, obviously. But I'm not saying that I believe that we should be running the modern economy on physical gold, because that's not possible. I mean, the gold standard fell apart because, one, gold wasn't divisible enough to reflect the sophistication of the division of labor, be able to make accurate comparisons between things, because you weren't able to, like, I need just this little teeny bit of gold. How am I going to transfer, some gold dust for a loaf of bread? It's not going to work. You have to come up with something better. So you have to have silver and then maybe copper or whatever in order to try and figure these things out. Now, electronic gold today, again, the electronic systems for money make a lot of sense because they're infinitely fungible. This is why the cryptocurrencies are so interesting, because you don't have to inflate them to... Okay, let's back up for a second. Part of the reason, I believe this fundamentally, part of the reason, why did the gold standard fail? The gold standard failed because gold wasn't capable of being divisible enough in what's the word? Movable forms, right? Tangible forms from one place to another in order to carry out all of the transactions and all of the comparisons needed within a society. We outstripped that ages ago. So we went from carrying around gold coins to carrying around base metal coins along with gold coins, which were then, which should have some relative value to each other, but they really don't, yada, 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 and all this stuff. Eventually, the gold paper certificates, and so we're not carrying those around, and all of this other stuff. But the gold standard eventually failed simply because the world, quote unquote, needed more inflation than gold at the price of $35 an ounce, and $20 and $20 to the pound. And really, the big one was $20 to the pound, $20 to the pound, $20 to the ounce, pre-World War I. What created the depression of the late post World War I were the Brits, after spending unbelievable amounts of money creating all this credit to pay for World War I, then tried to go back on a gold standard, tried to refix the pound to $20 to refix the pound. It didn't work. I think 20 pounds to the ounce or whatever, or Yeah, something like that. It's 20 pounds to the ounce. Whatever it was, 16 pounds to the ounce or whatever. It doesn't matter. They tried to refix it at the pre-war price. That didn't work because there's 18 times the amount of money circulating around. They should have immediately raised the price of gold, devalued the pound relative to gold, and everything would have been fine. What they did was they held that, and then of course people were trying to pay off these massive debts with gold at this price, and the whole society collapsed, and the whole system collapsed, because now all of a sudden, overnight they just raised the value of everybody's debt by 10 times. Imagine you're running your business based on owing $2,000, and all of a sudden, no, we just cut the price of gold by 1/10, then it's really $20,000. Well, I'm still making $3,000 a year. Or $5,000 a year. How the fuck am I supposed to pay a $20,000 debt? You don't. You default on it, the whole system, and the banks collapse. So that's part of the problem here, is that's the first thing. And so the same thing was happening to the United States. We were printing money through the Federal Reserve throughout the 20s, far greater than we could justify a $20 per ounce gold price. And so during the sovereign debt crisis of Europe, and during the massive deflation that was happening from starting in 1929 all the way through the early part of the 1930s, $20 an ounce in gold wasn't going to cut it. We needed more money, right? So to liquefy the system, FDR hyperinflated the dollar. Overnight, the dollar went from $20 to an ounce to $35. At the same time, though, and that wouldn't have worked, by the way. That would have just been a hyperinflationary event, just like everything else. It was a hyperinflationary event. The United States, in 1 month, went through 75% inflation. It was hyperinflation. The United States went through hyperinflation in 1933. It was a stealth hyperinflation, but it was hyperinflation nonetheless. Even Martin Armstrong refuses to admit that this is hyperinflation. I look at him like, it's 18,000% friggin' inflation. Is that not hyperinflation? Or 1,800%, whatever 75 times 12 is. On an annualized basis. No, what actually saved the U.S. banking system was the implementation of FDIC. That brought confidence back into the banking system. Didn't matter what the price of gold, didn't matter what the price of the dollar was relative to gold at that point. But we really did, we're losing the thread. We didn't have enough currency units, not units, but divisibility to allow for the comparisons that needed to be taken. So we needed to start moving away from that, and we had to move into a quote unquote inflationary environment, right? Because as value is added and prices of last year's goods eventually will drop to zero 10 years from now, right? And so what do you do? How do you value that at that point? How do you value an IBM computer from 1979 that cost $3,600? You probably get it for free today. It's probably actually got negative worth because it costs more money to dispose of it than it does to actually have it, unless you just want to have it on your shelf as an heirloom or something. So, so there is an argument for, an ever-inflating monetary system, monetary supply. And I've had arguments with subscribers about this behind the scenes on our Slack channel and whatnot. And I get that argument. I prefer the other way around, because this way you're not inflating away, you're not counterfeiting money and destroying monetary units of those who save. What you should be doing is working with monetary units that in and of themselves are the money is not deflationary, but at least neutral. It is relatively deflationary, but you can create infinite fungibility. Because a person who owns a Bitcoin today at $4,000, or a person who owned a Bitcoin when I first got into Bitcoin at 6 cents, still has a Bitcoin today. I could still trade Bitcoins for candy bars. Back then, it cost me 5 Bitcoins, or it cost me, 20 Bitcoins to buy a candy bar. Today, it cost me 1/200th. Sorry, 1/200th of a Bitcoin. 2,000th of a Bitcoin to buy a candy bar. But the transaction is exactly the same. But had I held on to all those Bitcoins, my savings would have gone up in value tremendously, right? Think about it. better to infinitely, because what you're then doing is now you have a real comparison through time of the wealth that you've saved relative to what the world has created before you. Actually, because of increases in productivity, prices should decline. Oh yeah, deflation is good. Edwin Smith, you're absolutely right. I'm not arguing with you. What I'm trying to say is that there's also, that deflationary process is fighting with the need for more finer comparisons between objects. Okay? And that's why you kind of need to inflate the money in order to make that work. Because what are you going to, because if we hadn't done that, then candy bars would have dropped to the point where they'd be less than a penny. Or something like that. You know what I mean? That's the argument. I'm not saying that I fully agree with that argument. I don't think that that's the reason why we should just continue to inflate the money supply. I don't agree with that at all, because I think it's fraudulent. The opposite is better. Take humans out of the decision-making process of when to bring new monetary units into existence, which is what we have today. The Fed decides and the Treasury decides. No. Fuck that. And in a gold standard, the gold miners decide, but at least that's a market-driven process. Right? If the gold miners bring too much gold onto the market, the price of gold falls because, same number of goods chasing more money chasing the same number of goods, prices thereby fall. So the price of gold relative to their production costs, what they can sell it for relative to their production costs, that return drops, their profit margin drops. Once it drops below a critical level, they stop mining. And the price of gold will rise, and then they start mining again, and then we play that game. And that's the way and the same argument about the natural rate of interest should attenuate up and down depending on economic conditions, and perfectly reasonable. That's the way it should work. But the real revolution of cryptocurrencies, is the fact that they're algorithmic, and the size of their money supply is algorithmic. That is what the real genius of them is. Because it's out of the hands of the humans. Once they set it in motion, it's gone. It's God the cosmic clockmaker. It's a fucking deist system. It just goes. And eventually all 21 million Bitcoins will be in circulation. And that'll be it. And then the network, hopefully at that point, which it should be, is profitable enough to sustain itself by paying the people who mine the blocks to mine for the rewards, and not just the new rewards, but the rewards from the people using the currency who will pay the transaction fees to maintain the network. And if it doesn't, and if Bitcoin proves to be too expensive, well, then one of these new hybrid proof of work, proof of stake systems, or distributed proof of work systems, or whatever. And I've talked about these guys before. The coins like Komodo and Decred and others that I think are absolutely brilliant. Will create will drive those costs down to near zero, but not zero. And they will still be incorruptible. And there will still have been positive work done, so they will still satisfy Mises's regression theorem as commodity money. And therefore, they will be fine. They're allowed to compete with other currencies, and that's fine as well. And I want competing cryptocurrencies. And then he says, in any theoretical system, I want there to be no barrier to entry to new cryptocurrencies. Because that one might not serve the economy 30 years from now, but shifting from one to the other shouldn't be terribly difficult. I am right at the point where everybody gets lost. Ah, that's funny. I'm sorry. I actually haven't been looking at any of the comments tonight at all, really. Okay, so let me go back and let me look at some of the comments real quick. We're at an hour now. I should stop soon, but yeah. Rise in variations. The best protection against financial corruption or periodic depressions, absolutely, where assets are sold at true market value, i.e. they are at depressed and distressed prices. Yes, I agree. Periodically, rascals have to be flushed out. Absolutely. The best thing that happened to the cryptocurrency markets? Bitcoin dropping from 20,000 to 3,800. Without a doubt. Yes, Islamic banking is effectively profit sharing. In Hong Kong, a mortgage is about 2% interest. I wonder why that can't happen in the USA, because the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the United States dollar. Hong Kong gets massive capital flows because of their unique relationship relative to China and being the offshore yuan banking center that it is. And it's a very, very stable environment that will allow for that. I'm not crazy about the Hong Kong dollar being pegged. I fully expect the Hong Kong dollar at some point to be depegged, because all currency pegs fail eventually, and then mortgage rates in Hong Kong will most likely rise. What place do patents play in the economic process? I'm not a big fan of intellectual property. I think it's an oxymoron. So that should tell you where I am. The problem with patents, not that I don't think that creators should be paid for their work. They should be. But should they be paid in perpetuity? Should they be paid for a long period of time? Should they share their idea with the world and then immediately have their profit ground out by some copycat? Well, I got news for you. Copyright law and the patent law is all a fiction anyway. This is part of the thing that Trump is trying to fight with this whole IP theft thing and with China. It's at the end of the day, China's like, fuck you. Your IP laws and our IP laws are never going to be compatible, period. Just because you think you're the ones who create everything great in the world and we just steal stuff doesn't mean, what happens when the shoe's on the other foot and we start creating all the good stuff. And you're going to just steal our stuff, and then what are we going to do? The truth of the matter is that if you have to point a gun at somebody to enforce something, it's not a particularly good idea. You got to get a third party, especially, to point a gun at you, to point a gun at them to say, don't do that. It's not a good idea. And at the end of the day, intellectual property, you have to ultimately restrict the use of my private property to enforce your intellectual property. So if you can get around that, then you can have your intellectual property. And I'm good with that. Cigarettes should be the new currency. Why do the leftists in academia refer to the best as the gold standard? I really think that we're excuse me, we're going to see a gold cover clause at the end of all this, but that's another discussion for another night. All right, let's see. This may be a dumb question, but what is Bitcoin mining? Oh, God. It's not really a dumb question, but I think you should really just kind of look it up, but I'll explain it in simple terms. So the way Bitcoin works is this. All the transactions that happen across the Bitcoin network they happen. They're broadcast to the network, and there's all these addresses sending bits of Bitcoins back and forth and everywhere, and it's all a big peer-to-peer network, and they're all just talking to each other and sending. So what happens is every 10 minutes, all those transactions are hashed together and put into a block of information, encrypted, and then that block of information is sent broadcast around the network. At that point, everybody who's running a full node of the Bitcoin software, that's not only just passing the information on the network along to other people, but is actually now working on, will then grab that block and try to solve it. And try to unpack the information that's in it. Thereby proving the information that was put into it was true and correct. By doing that, the Bitcoin network, that's called mining. And you're brute forcing this. You're just taking raw computing power and just doing hundreds of millions of trial and error to find the right solution to that problem, that cryptographic problem. Once once the first person to get it does that, they get all the rewards that have been, that all of the transaction fees that have been attached to all the transactions that are originally put into the block. They get all those, and as of right now, continue to get a reward from the Bitcoin network itself, which then springs new Bitcoins into existence. Now this is done, and every so many blocks, every 32,000 blocks, I can't remember. Every so often, the reward pool halves. So originally they were giving out 50 Bitcoins, then 25, then 12 and a half, then 6 1/4, then 3 1/8, then 1 1/16, and yada yada, and so on and so on and so on, until we get to the theoretical limit of 21 million Bitcoins, at which point that will stop. And that's where the inflation of Bitcoin comes in. That's what I was talking about earlier about this is out of the decision-making process of humans is out of the question. Every 10 minutes, X number of Bitcoins are going to come into existence, period, paragraph, end of story. Done. That's it. Because someone's going to find that block, solve it, bing, and get the reward. It's just like mining. It's just like striking gold, except you're doing it mathematically. So there's work, because you have to use computing power and electricity and time and this and expertise in order to bring those Bitcoins into existence. It requires work. The process I just described is called proof of work. I am proving to you that I did the work to figure out what you did by passing the information in that block together. Now the question is, and this is where people get hung up, does the information in that block have value? If it has value, then one could argue that it's a commodity-based currency. Because in order for something to satisfy Mises's regression theorem, which I absolutely recommend you go look up, is that for money to acquire value, for a commodity to ascend to the level of becoming money, in order for that to happen, it had to have had commodity value before anybody ever considered using it as money. And have commodity value, not necessarily intrinsic value, just commodity value, some amount. Now, things like copper and gold and silver and, mung beans and corn and everything, all these things have commodity value. Coffee. I'm not saying they're good money. There are other factors that go into money, but every one of those things has the potential to become money, because they had commodity value beforehand, because someone thought they had value at some point in a previous point in its existence. So now the question, this is a great article by one of the guys at Mises. I've got it linked in one of the old articles that I wrote on my blog a year ago or so about this. I think it was you look up like the pool of real savings article that I wrote on my blog, because it's referenced in there. He goes through makes the argument for the implied value of the packets of information that contain the quote unquote new Bitcoins, and he described it in terms of implied value, and that implicit value, that we want those things to have value, therefore they're going to have value, therefore they do have value. It's kind of the way he put it. I'm doing a bad job of describing the argument, but it's a perfectly valid way of looking at it. I just say this very simply: do encrypted packets on the internet have value? You're all listening to my voice right now, and guess what? You're all looking at my ugly mug. Guess what? You think this has value? You're watching me. This is all just my camera taking a picture in real time, 30 frames a second, transforming it into bits, sending it out over a wire. YouTube decodes it and sends it out to you. Those are encrypted packets. They have value to you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching this stream. This is the argument I made to the Austrian economics gurus back in 2010. 10 minutes after I read the white paper on Bitcoin. I'm like, no. And they all said, nah, it's all bullshit. It's electronic money. It's not real. I'm like, no, bullshit. It absolutely has value. I remember arguing. I remember this, and I'm the only one. That was the first guy within the circle of people attached to the Mises Institute at that time, writing for Lou Rockwell. I said, "Bitcoin is brilliant. It's fucking digital gold." And everybody looked at me like I had 4 heads. About 6 months later, Michael Rosev emailed me directly behind the scenes and asked me about it because he said he was writing a paper on Bitcoin. He said, "Tom, I want you to review this for me because you're the only one here who understands what Bitcoin is. Tell me if I've got this right." No shit, no lie. I'm not making shit up here. The hat saves the day, Tom. All right, so does that make life, does that like make life clear as mud for y'all? I'm gonna have to retitle this because it's certainly the current title on it doesn't make any sense relative to what I actually talked about tonight, which I think is really funny. All right, I should probably go. It's an hour and 10 minutes, and I'm getting tired, and my voice is gonna go, and I'm gonna just start like coughing uncontrollably in the microphone, and that's just not a good look. All right, what about collective ownership of the airwaves? I think we'll save that for another night, Laura Powers, but it's an interesting question. I'm not a big fan of. I believe that the FCC is a real problem, and that all the frequencies should be up for bid, and should be open for, not just open for bid, but should be open for. They should be owned, just like the ocean should be owned. But let's not get into like, you know, weird ass fucking edge case libertarian shit, because that's not really what's important. What is important is understanding why the banking system is fraudulent and why it has to fail. That's why I went through all the discussion of this stuff tonight, so you understand what real banking is supposed to look like as opposed to what we actually do, and the infinite gulf between those two things, so that you understand why it is that system creates the very power structures and the very freaking corruption and horrible shit that we see everywhere, and why someone like Tulsi Gabbard, I'm going to take it right back to the beginning, why someone like Tulsi Gabbard is actually quite interesting. Because I think at a fundamental level, she gets all this stuff. And I urge you guys, if you're not convinced by her, and I'm not fully convinced, but I'm far more convinced by her than I was before I watched this morning, go watch her for an hour and 45 minutes chat with Joe Rogan, and watch how she refuses at multiple times to be boxed into a corner as just like the Bernie girl, and all of this stuff, and why, and what she's talking about, and who she is, because you can see it. Once she opens up, once she loosens up a little bit, you see immediately that what she's trying to do is not come across like me, like someone who really feels this passionately about it, they're willing to just scream into a microphone about it. That she's trying to like walk the line and be presidential, while at the same time feeling very strongly about what needs to be done and where the vectors of corruption are and what the big ones are. We can argue about all the little stuff later. The big ones. And the big ones, to me, she gets. And I think she's honest about it. I hope she's honest about it. And if she's not, well, you know, fuck it. What do we got to lose? Because that's the real issue at this point. What do we got to lose? We rolled the dice on Donald Trump, for Christ's sake. We found out, we knew he was a scumbag. All right? So I you know, and what I was gonna try and before I go, the last thing to say is, what I was gonna try and turn this talk into was one to say, look, at some point, you come off your libertarian hobby horse and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, to quote Murray Rothbard. She's not perfect, but she's pretty good. And I'll bet you dollars to dog shit that if I could get into a room with Tulsi Gabbard for an hour and discuss one or two issues, I could probably convince her on guns. I could probably craft position points for her that would be incredibly successful. Not politically, but practically. And she would be interested in them. Because when you listen to her talk, she's thinking systemically. She's thinking about systematic problems. She's looking for root cause analysis. That kind of thinking is unbelievably rare in Washington, D.C. And even if she's only 30% better than everybody who's up there, she's 30% better. Don't let the enemy be the perfect or the good. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. All right. Can I talk about the USMCA at some point? It brings the U.S. concept closer to the North American Union. Obviously, Trump hasn't read it. It's NAFTA plus TPP times 20. I could, but you just, Philip, you just like laid it out perfectly. Actually, the guys who are really well-versed in this, Philip, are my friends Halsey and Dustin. Halsey English and Dustin Gold. Tomorrow night, I'll be on with them at 10 o'clock like I am every week now. Tune in for that one. I'm sure if I prompt Dustin about the NAFTA reorg, he'll just go off for 20 minutes and you'll get everything you wanted to hear. It'd be great. Me interviewing Tulsi Gabbard would be sick. It would be sick. It would be fun. I would actually keep it clean and I would try not to drool because every time she opens her mouth, she just gets hotter. Because that's what happens when you take good-looking women and then you add a brain and like conscientiousness and all of that. Unbelievable. All right, you guys take care. I gotta go. We'll see you on Friday. Put up an article on ZH soon. I have to put an article up on my blog first, and then ZH will scrape it. And I've got to finish the issue tomorrow. I will try and get a blog post or something out tomorrow. Maybe another short live stream on something else. But you guys take care. You have a great afternoon. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.